In the Cold War, crises rarely began with explosions. More often, they began with documents. Quiet, analytical, and written far from public view. One such report, produced in the early 1980s, nearly pushed two nuclear powers toward irreversible decisions, not because it revealed a new threat, but because it reinterpreted an old one. The report was classified from the moment it was written. Its circulation was limited to a small group of senior intelligence officials. It did not come from a field operation or an intercepted transmission. It was an internal analytical assessment, built entirely on existing data, patterns, and assumptions. That was what made it dangerous. The report examined a series of routine developments, military exercises, communication delays, shifts in posture that had occurred dozens of times before. Individually, none of them were alarming. Together, the report argued they formed a coherent pattern. According to its authors, the pattern suggested preparation rather than coincidence. What set this report apart was its tone. It did not present probability. It presented confidence. The language was firm, decisive, and urgent. It warned that waiting for confirmation could mean waiting too long. The system, it argued, had to act before ambiguity hardened into threat. Inside intelligence headquarters, the report landed at a moment of heightened tension. Political pressure was high. Decision-makers demanded clarity, not nuance. The report seemed to offer exactly that, but not everyone agreed. A minority of analysts raised concerns immediately. They argued that the report relied too heavily on interpretation rather than evidence, that it transformed uncertainty into intent, that it treated absence of information as confirmation rather than caution. These objections were noted, but sidelined. The reason was simple. The report fit the prevailing narrative. For months, intelligence assessments had trended toward escalation. Signals were being read pessimistically. Routine actions were framed as deliberate messaging. The report did not introduce this logic. It crystallized it. As the report moved upward through the chain of command, its conclusions hardened. Caveats were removed. Conditional language disappeared. What began as analysis started to resemble warning. This was the moment when the report crossed a line. It no longer described a possible scenario. It implied inevitability. That implication triggered a cascade of secondary actions. Alert levels were reviewed. Contingency plans were revisited. Communication channels were tested. None of these steps were public. None were dramatic. But each one shortened the distance between interpretation and action. What made the situation especially volatile was that the opposing side had not changed its behavior. There were no new provocations, no sudden moves. The report had amplified existing signals rather than responding to new ones. Inside the intelligence community, unease spread quietly. Some officers recognized the pattern. They had seen it before in historical case studies, moments when analysis fed on itself, when confirmation bias accelerated decision-making. But momentum is difficult to stop once it begins. The report had achieved something rare. It had aligned analytical confidence with political urgency. Questioning it now carried risk. Doubt could be interpreted as weakness. Delay could be framed as irresponsibility. The crisis did not erupt that day, but the report had shifted the system into a dangerous posture. One where decisions were being prepared not in response to action, but in anticipation of interpretation. And in the Cold War, anticipation could be as destabilizing as attack. The report that almost triggered a crisis had not revealed new facts. It had revealed how close certainty could come to replacing caution. As the report circulated among senior officials, its influence expanded beyond analysis and into behavior. What had begun as an internal assessment quietly reshaped how information was interpreted across multiple departments. Incoming data was no longer evaluated neutrally. It was filtered through the report's conclusions. This shift was subtle but decisive. Signals that once would have been dismissed as routine were now flagged for review. Delays that had previously been attributed to technical issues were reclassified as intentional. The absence of communication was no longer neutral. It became suspicious. In this environment, ambiguity stopped being a buffer and started becoming evidence. The report's authors had not intended this outcome. Their goal was to warn against complacency, but the clarity of their language removed space for doubt. The document offered a narrative that was easy to follow and difficult to challenge. Once accepted, it demanded consistency. Inside intelligence headquarters, this created pressure. Analysts who questioned the report's assumptions found themselves isolated. Their objections were framed as theoretical rather than practical. Decision-makers wanted actionable conclusions, not debates. The report provided a framework that transformed uncertainty into urgency. At the same time, external developments appeared to reinforce its claims. Routine military exercises coincided with unrelated diplomatic tensions. communication anomalies occurred in parallel with political rhetoric. None of these connections were causal, but correlation was enough to sustain concern. What made the situation particularly dangerous was feedback. As alert levels increased, the opposing side noticed. Their own analysts began interpreting defensive measures as confirmation of hostile intent. Each adjustment on one side generated interpretation on the other. The system was beginning to echo itself. This dynamic was not new. It had been studied extensively in Cold War simulations. Analysts knew that misinterpretation could escalate faster than intent. But knowing the theory did not always prevent its repetition. Under pressure, systems defaulted to decisiveness. Efforts were made to slow the process. Quiet reviews were requested. Alternative explanations were circulated informally. Some analysts attempted to reintroduce probability language into summaries. These efforts had limited effect. The report's conclusions had already shaped expectations. The crisis did not emerge from a single decision. It emerged from accumulation. Each small adjustment felt reasonable in isolation. Together they created momentum. What remained missing was confirmation. No direct evidence supported the report's most severe conclusions. There were no intercepted orders, no mobilization signals, no explicit threats. The danger came from what might be happening, not what was known. Inside the system, this absence became paradoxical. The longer confirmation failed to appear, the more it was interpreted as concealment. The report had anticipated this logic. It warned that waiting for proof could mean waiting until it was too late. This argument was persuasive and flawed. It assumed that lack of evidence was evidence of intent. That assumption compressed decision timelines. It reduced tolerance for uncertainty. It pushed the system toward preemption rather than observation. At this stage, the crisis was no longer theoretical. Contingency plans were being updated. Communication channels were placed on heightened readiness. Analysts were instructed to prioritize speed over depth. The report had not ordered these actions, but it had made them feel necessary. And once necessity replaces caution, reversing course becomes increasingly difficult. The system was approaching a threshold, not because of an enemy move, but because of a conclusion that had begun to behave like fact. As the pressure increased, the intelligence system entered a phase where reversal became politically and psychologically costly. The report had created an internal expectation of danger, and that expectation began to shape behavior more strongly than incoming data. Inside briefing rooms, language shifted. Analysts stopped, asking whether the interpretation was correct and began asking how soon it might be proven right. Timelines replaced probabilities. Scenarios replaced questions. The report was no longer a document. It was a reference point. Senior officials demanded updates that aligned with the report's framework. Deviations were viewed as anomalies rather than alternatives. This did not happen through orders or directives. It happened through tone, through emphasis, through the unspoken understanding of what kind of analysis was welcome. The danger of this phase lay in convergence. Multiple departments began reinforcing the same conclusions independently, not because they shared evidence, but because they shared assumptions. This convergence created the illusion of confirmation. In reality, it was amplification. Signals from different sources were treated as validation when they were merely parallel interpretations of the same incomplete picture. The report's logic echoed back through the system, stronger each time it returned. A small group of analysts recognized what was happening. They had studied historical crises where escalation had occurred without intent. They warned that the system was interpreting itself rather than the adversary. Their arguments were precise, cautious, and deeply unpopular. They faced a structural problem. The report had framed delay as risk. Any attempt to slow down could be portrayed as negligence. The burden of proof had shifted. Skeptics now had to prove that nothing was happening, a task far more difficult than arguing that something might be. Outside the intelligence community, political leaders sensed urgency. Briefings emphasized preparedness. Options were discussed in increasingly concrete terms. The distinction between contingency and intention blurred. What made the moment especially unstable was that the opposing side still had not changed its behavior. There were no new deployments, no public signals, no escalation. The crisis existed almost entirely within interpretation. Yet interpretation had consequences. Communication channels were tested more frequently. Readiness procedures were reviewed again. Each action was defensive. Each was justified. But each also generated response. The opposing side's analysts began to notice patterns of concern. They too started drawing conclusions. This mutual observation created a closed loop. Both sides reacted to the perception of reaction. The report's warning about feedback had become reality. At this stage, no single individual could halt the process. The system was functioning exactly as designed: rapid, responsive, decisive. The flaw was not malfunction, it was alignment. Everything pointed in the same direction. The only missing element was a triggering event. A misread signal, a technical failure, a coincidence. Any one of these could have been enough, and everyone involved understood that. What prevented immediate escalation was not clarity, but hesitation. Some decision-makers sensed that the system was moving faster than understanding. They requested one more review, one more cross-check, one more assessment. This pause was brief but critical. It forced analysts to confront a simple question. If the report was correct, where was the confirming evidence? If preparation was underway, why had no unmistakable indicators appeared? That question had no easy answer. For the first time since the report's release, certainty weakened. Not enough to reverse course, but enough to slow momentum. The system hovered at a dangerous edge, and the report that had nearly triggered a crisis now faced its first serious challenge. The pause did not end the crisis, but it changed its trajectory. By slowing the pace of interpretation, it exposed how fragile the report's certainty really was. Analysts were forced to return to the raw data rather than its conclusions. What they found was not reassurance, but complexity. The signals that had seemed coherent under the report's framework became ambiguous again. Patterns dissolved into coincidence. Timelines overlapped without clear direction. The sense of inevitability weakened. What remained was uncertainty, uncomfortable, unresolved, and difficult to communicate upward. This created a new problem. Admitting uncertainty after weeks of urgency carried its own risk. Decision-makers had already internalized the report's warnings. Reversing course could be interpreted as indecision or loss of control. The system had to slow down without appearing to retreat. Intelligence leadership chose recalibration over reversal. Language in briefings softened. Words like inevitable and imminent were replaced with possible and contingent. Scenarios were reframed as alternatives rather than expectations. This shift was subtle enough to preserve authority, but significant enough to reduce pressure. At the same time, analysts expanded their scope. Instead of searching for confirmation of hostile intent, they examined reasons why such intent might not exist. This inversion was difficult. It required challenging the report's assumptions without discrediting it entirely. What emerged was a different interpretation. The opposing side's behavior could be explained by internal constraints. Rather than preparation, exercises followed routine cycles. Communication gaps aligned with technical limitations. Actions previously viewed as signals began to resemble inertia. None of this disproved the report, but it weakened its urgency. The report had not been wrong. It had been incomplete. It assumed that interpretation itself was neutral. It underestimated how pressure, expectation, and fear could shape conclusions faster than evidence. As this realization spread, the feedback loop began to loosen. Alerts were not cancelled, but they were no longer escalated automatically. Review processes regained depth. Dissenting views were documented rather than dismissed. The crisis did not resolve through a dramatic decision. It deflated gradually, like pressure leaking from a sealed system. No announcement marked the moment of change. No official acknowledgement followed. The report simply lost its grip. What remained was unease. The intelligence community understood how close it had come to acting on interpretation rather than fact. The realization was sobering. Systems designed to prevent surprise had nearly created one. The report was quietly downgraded in priority. It remained classified. It remained respected, but it no longer drove behavior. Its conclusions were treated as one possibility among many. For those involved, the episode left a lasting impression. It demonstrated how easily analysis could become momentum, and how difficult it was to stop once it began. The crisis had not required deception or provocation. It had required only confidence. By the time external tensions eased, the report had been absorbed into institutional memory, not as a warning about the adversary, but as a warning about interpretation itself. The system had stepped back from the edge, but it knew now how close that edge had been. And that knowledge would shape how the final chapter of the crisis was remembered. The crisis ended without a decision, without an announcement, and without acknowledgement. That was precisely what made it dangerous. Nothing had happened, and yet everything had almost happened. The report that nearly triggered a crisis was never officially discredited. It remained classified, cited selectively, and discussed carefully. Its conclusions were not erased. They were contextualized. Over time, it became a case study rather than a directive. Inside intelligence circles, the episode forced a quiet reckoning. Analysts recognized that the threat had not come from the adversary's actions, but from the system's reaction to its own interpretation. The report had not fabricated danger. It had accelerated belief. This distinction mattered. The intelligence community began reassessing how certainty formed under pressure, how language shaped urgency, how consensus could emerge not from evidence, but from repetition. The report exposed a vulnerability that no external enemy could have exploited more effectively. What ultimately prevented escalation was not superior intelligence or diplomatic intervention. It was hesitation, a brief pause in which decision-makers allowed uncertainty to exist rather than forcing resolution. That pause broke the momentum. In retrospect, the crisis revealed a fundamental truth of the Cold War. The greatest risk was not surprise attack, but self-reinforcing interpretation. Systems designed to detect threat could create it by assuming intent where none existed. The opposing side never learned how close the situation had come to escalation. From their perspective, nothing unusual had occurred. Routine continued, exercises ended, communication resumed. The crisis existed almost entirely within analysis. That invisibility made it harder to explain and easier to repeat. The report was eventually archived, still classified, its most sensitive sections never released. Official histories mentioned periods of tension, but not the document that had driven them. The crisis left no scar visible to the public. Inside intelligence institutions, however, the lesson endured. Analysts learned to question not only data, but the frameworks interpreting it. Probability regained importance. Dissent became less costly. Urgency was treated with greater suspicion. These changes were gradual and imperfect, but real. The report that almost triggered a crisis did not fail. It succeeded too well. It aligned fear, interpretation, and authority into a single narrative. That alignment was what nearly pushed the system beyond control. In the end, restraint prevailed, not because the report was wrong, but because it was incomplete. It had described what might happen without accounting for how belief itself could become a threat. The crisis faded quietly into history. No alarm sounded, no decisions were recorded, but those who witnessed it understood how close certainty had come to replacing caution.